Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Monday, October 21st, 2024, and today we are going to be taking a look at a brand new set of polls conducted by the Washington Post across the 7 battleground states and what they are showing us for the outcome of this presidential election. Now, the Washington Post numbers come as a bit of good news for the Kamala Harris campaign, as they saw today, this morning, the FiveThirtyEight forecast switch in favor of former President Trump at 53 to 47. But the new set of high-quality polls from the Washington Post show Kamala Harris in a pretty competitive position in some of these battleground states. Despite a lot of the mainstream media narrative that this race is moving away from the vice president, these numbers would actually suggest otherwise. And I'm not here to say that these polls are the gold standard and that they are the most accurate ones that we could be working with in this cycle. They are quite accurate and have a strong track record of being accurate, but they aren't the end-all be-all. In the same way we conduct analysis on the New York Times Siena College polls, in the same way we do analysis on the Emerson College polls. A lot of the times, these polling firms do come up with substantive numbers that give us good results, have been accurate in the past, and in some cases, not. But it's worthwhile unpacking some high-quality polls when we rarely do see them across the battleground states. And the Washington Post numbers actually show some really interesting ones that deserve their own video. Now, their headline here is that Harris and Trump are locked in dead heat in 7 states across the country. And that's absolutely true. What they're finding is that in every single battleground state that they have surveyed, not a single one is outside the margin of error, which actually makes a bit of sense. Otherwise, they really wouldn't be swing states. And the margin of error here is close enough that Donald Trump and Kamala Harris could reasonably be winning some of these states where Donald Trump has the upper hand, Kamala Harris has the upper hand. But like I said, top line numbers here, while it may be competitive, Kamala Harris does in fact come ahead. And a lot of that is attributed to the numbers that we see here altogether. Amongst registered voters, the numbers are a bit less beneficial for Kamala Harris, but amongst likely voters, her lead expands. And a big reason that she holds a lead in some of these battleground states comes down to her support amongst young women in particular, shifting further and further away. The gender gap is as wide as we've ever seen in a presidential election, but specifically amongst young voters, it is the widest we have ever seen amongst any demographic group in U.S. history. And that matters, right? It's coming to a point where Donald Trump is winning a significant chunk of young men, according to the Washington Post, a significant number of young women, according to the Washington Post, and yet one is being more heavy than the other because Kamala Harris holds a larger advantage amongst young women than Trump does amongst young men. And an important point here, too, is that Kamala Harris, despite not being someone who voters across these 7 battleground states view as as positive in terms of how they view her from a favorability standpoint, from a job as vice president standpoint, she still is winning voters over on issues like abortion, on issues like healthcare, and in some cases running roughly even with that of the former president on issues like the economy. And so unpacking what we're going to be seeing here, I'm going to actually translate some of the numbers we've been working with on our map here from our traditional electoral map. This is typically what we work with. We just haven't characterized Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Georgia, Arizona, and Nevada. And I want you to really just see visually what the numbers are telling us about this cycle. And so a lot of things can really be unpacked throughout here. They talk about different demographic groups. They talk about a really big education divide that we're seeing amongst white voters across the country. We're seeing about how people are really engaging with things like advertisements, things like text messaging, phone banking, canvassing, all of these different things. But none of this really is substantive enough to say that it's swinging the election. And so in unpacking all of it on a more service level, we're going to look at the swing state polls. There's so much more information from the Washington Post poll. This is really why they are such high quality pollsters, because they release so much information down to the wire, down to the nitty-gritty, rather, in these battleground states that are definitely worth unpacking. But for the sake of an election analysis focused on, 16 days out from the cycle, what the polls are telling us, our main focus here is going to be on the swing states. And so at large here, Kamala Harris holds roughly a 1-point advantage amongst key state likely voters. So on average, across the 7 states, her lead here is roughly a point, which on its own isn't phenomenal, but it's a lead nonetheless, and we can unpack it on a state-by-state basis. In the state of Arizona, that's the first one here, we're going in alphabetical order. Donald Trump holds roughly a 3-point advantage over Kamala Harris, 49 to 46. That's pretty substantial for Donald Trump. But if that was to be consistent, many of these other states wouldn't be swinging the same way, and we can talk about why there might be differences in some of these states. What the Washington Post finds in Georgia is that Kamala Harris is at 51%. Now, I don't believe that she's winning the state by 4 points, but I do think there's a reason to believe that maybe she could be winning in the state of Georgia. Right now, I have Donald Trump winning it in my own forecast, but it's not out of the reality that Kamala Harris could win the state. It's only a lean state in my forecast at most for Donald Trump, and that's well within a reasonable margin of error. What they're finding here is that Kamala Harris is up by 4. In Michigan, they're finding that Kamala Harris leads by roughly 2 points. And again, we can talk a bit about why that might be, why we could see Georgia and Michigan vote differently in this cycle. And there actually is a reality, and I know this sounds crazy to say. I don't think it's our current one, but I think it's a, reasonable conclusion we could arise to on Election Day in the event that Georgia votes to the left of Michigan. Now, call me crazy now, because first of all, I don't think that's going to happen as of right now, but call me crazy if it happens, because I do think what we have found between Georgia and Michigan is that should Michigan start to revert away from Kamala Harris like we've been seeing over the past week and Georgia start to inch closer to her, it's a possibility that, especially maybe not this cycle, but in future cycles, because Michigan is becoming a state that has a higher concentration of non-college educated white voters that tend to be the strongest base for the Republican Party in comparison to states like Georgia, where you're starting to see an increase of white college educated voters and voters of color across the state. There could be a circumstance in 2028, for instance, where Georgia does vote to the left of Michigan, and it might happen this cycle. I don't think it's going to, but what the poll is telling us here is that, hey, this might actually happen this cycle. So it would be really fascinating if it did. Obviously, that's not where I stand on it, but the Washington Post numbers say, look twice. So, Georgia, Michigan, Harris holds the lead in those states. Donald Trump holds the lead in Arizona. In Nevada, it's a dead even tie. So we're not even going to characterize it. It's going to stay 6 electoral votes uncharacterized. Neither candidate seems to be in the advantage. A bit of a pullback away from Harris, who has maintained a lead in Nevada since the beginning of her entrance into the race. Now for North Carolina, Donald Trump holds a 3-point advantage. So similar to that of Arizona, North Carolina would be shifting 2 points to the right from 2020. Arizona 3 points to the right. Again, if that was to be consistent, Michigan would be red, and so would Georgia. But in both cases, some of these states are moving in different directions. And again, we can talk about that at length later on in this video. The next state is Pennsylvania. Kamala Harris holds a 2-point lead in that state that puts her over the 270 needed to win the election. And in Wisconsin, Kamala Harris holds a 3-point lead, according to the Washington Post. And so this is where we are, orienting ourselves really to what the electoral map would look like, assuming the Washington Post is correct. It's a close race, right? This is as close as the 2004 presidential election. Not as close as 2000, which was decided ultimately by the Supreme Court, but 2004, where it's Kamala Harris, Tim Walz, 286, Donald Trump, J.D. Vance, 246, 6 toss-up electoral votes out of the state of Nevada. As of right now, Kamala Harris holds a narrow advantage, but ultimately still a close race. We're not going to characterize it. So, 286, 246, what does this mean? What does this show us? Well, first of all, it'd be a very similar map to that of the 2020 election. The only difference here is that Arizona's red and Nevada has yet to be called. And in true Nevada fashion, taking a while to get called. Jokes aside, Arizona and Nevada are the only ones that really deviate from the 2020 election map. And it might be shocking, though, just even remembering that Georgia voted to the left of North Carolina. To remember where we were in 2016, North Carolina went to Trump by 3.7. Impressive, but not as impressive as Georgia, which went to Trump by 5.1. And yet 4 years later, Georgia went to the left, shifted over 5 points to the Democratic Party. Joe Biden wins the state by 0.2%. In North Carolina, Donald Trump only loses roughly 2% support across the state. So a 2-point shift in North Carolina, a 5-point shift in Georgia. And while I don't think Georgia's in this position right now where it's going to vote to the left of North Carolina, I do think North Carolina will vote to the left of Georgia, though I do think Donald Trump will win both states. In my current prediction, that's up in the air right before Election Day, because the margins at which I have all of these 7 battleground states, with limited exceptions, now are tilts, which sucks to say, but is the reality and nature of how close our election actually is. Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Georgia, Arizona, and Nevada are all within a reasonable margin of error. When you're looking at the polls, when you're looking at what the data is telling us, there's no difference there either. The Washington Post is the first high-quality pollster in a while to show Kamala Harris with a pretty substantive victory across the 3 Rust Belt states, across Georgia, tied in Nevada, and only losing 2 states like North Carolina and Arizona, which aren't even necessarily integral in her success in the election. But it is also shocking, too, to see Georgia voting to the left, not only of Michigan, but of of Pennsylvania and Wisconsin. In 2020, what we saw was that Wisconsin voted to the left of Georgia. Michigan voted to the left of Georgia. Pennsylvania voted to the left of Georgia. In fact, of all of the battleground states, Georgia was the closest race on the entire country, and it was the narrowest in favor of Biden. The narrowest in favor of Biden expanding to being the largest in favor of Harris seems like we've missed something, but also maybe not. A big part of this, too, is the fact that the polls might also be missing key portions of the electorate. And while maybe the Washington Post isn't right in assessing the current voter electorate that we come to know through the polls, maybe they are catching on to something is that we're missing in the punditry and in the polls. Talking about newly registered voters, right? We saw that in Georgia, right after Kamala Harris was announced as the presidential nominee or someone who was going to run on the Democratic ticket, we saw an explosion in voter registration amongst women across the state, and specifically black women across the state. We saw that Democratic key core electorate groups, black women, are the most beneficial voting group for Democrats across the country. The most in favor of Democrats, you're talking 90-point margins in terms of voter turnout. Black women have a higher voter turnout rate than of any other minority group, with the exception of Asian Americans. And you're talking to, when you're looking at Georgia, and you're looking specifically about why this matters, you're looking at places like the Atlanta metro area, where 67% of the state is comprised here. And when you're not even just seeing an explosion in voter registration amongst Black women, it is all across the board here, specifically to minority voters in Atlanta metro area. That matters for Kamala Harris's campaign. And maybe that could be boosting the state and driving it to the left. After all, 2012 to 2016 was about a 4-point shift to the left. 2016 to 2020 was about a 5-point shift to the left. Averaged out, 4.5-point shift on average over the past 8 years. What's to say that 4 more years go by and Georgia doesn't become the state that Democrats win by 4 points? Obviously, that's not going to happen, but logically speaking, there is a circumstance in which it does happen. I just don't think we're at that point yet, which can maybe explain why the Washington Post might have arrived at a number like Georgia +4 for Harris, but isn't something that I would say Democrats should bet on or count on. It's going to be a close race, and I still have Donald Trump having the upper hand in, but still the Washington Post. Again, I'm not one to argue with major pollsters. I do think, though, we can have conflicts in terms of predictions. I'm just relaying the numbers to you. Beyond that, though, Georgia, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, that's enough for Kamala Harris to win the election. In fact, you take away Georgia, she still wins. The only state you can't take away from the states she currently has is Pennsylvania. You take away Pennsylvania, Donald Trump wins the election. And that puts Donald Trump in a position where actually he doesn't actually win the election with Pennsylvania. It puts him at 265. He'd need the state of Nevada at that point, but it makes it a lot better. Anyways, what we've seen here is a building up of a firewall for the Democratic Party. They have the Rust Belt, they have Georgia, and they might have Nevada. It's numbers that are quite promising for Vice President Harris, really come at a time where the campaign is looking for some good news when it comes down to polling data, looking for some good news when it comes down to data analysis, and understanding, are our efforts working in the Rust Belt? Are our efforts working in North Carolina and Arizona and Georgia, and where do we need to reallocate funds? Standard answer, all 7 states. None of these 7 states are solid enough that you can say we can pull away $3 million from Wisconsin and move it over to Arizona. Unlike 2020, where we could have said that with reasonable thought, right? In 2020, we saw some reallocation of funds in the final stretch of the campaign. We saw the campaign go all in Georgia, really drive up turnout there. Clearly, the 11,000 votes made it all the difference, right? Major impact for Joe Biden, the first Democrat to win Georgia since 1992. And so, really, the investments in 2020 were quite strong. But this is the Washington Post is telling us. And so, knowing that this is the data points that we are at, this is sourced from September 30th through October 15th. What we know, too, is that some of this data has moved more in favor of Donald Trump as of recent. That's also entirely possible. I just think looking at these data points, 286 to 246 with 6 toss-ups is something that not enough to say that any candidate should ever feel comfortable with these numbers, but it's definitely pleasant news for the Kamala Harris campaign, where they previously were thinking no data points between now and the election. We're going to do them a benefit. We're going to show them in a competitive state, or even not necessarily in a competitive state, but in a position where they might be on track to win some of these battlegrounds. And I don't know if this is the last set of polls that we will see from the Washington Post. I think it's really difficult to tell when major pollsters are going to actually stop doing polling. Unfortunately, this cycle, unlike 2020, and especially unlike 2016, we have seen a lack of high-quality polls in some of these states because a lot of them got it wrong in 16 and 20, and so many of them are just sitting out the cycle. They're using it as a time to recalibrate, or they aren't getting the funding that they used to, right? When polls are wrong and people are sponsoring these polls, campaigns are partnering with major firms, if you get all of the elections wrong, they're not going to come back to you. Even if you promise, we've changed, we can do it right this time, they're not going to come back to you. They're going to go to somebody new. They're going to go to somebody else. Whatever it might be, sometimes it's not a perfect situation in which we can get the same pollsters back into some of these states, which is why this election also in particular has been quite difficult to really comprehend. Well, we've seen too, Nate Silver just recently did an analysis of the Republican skewed polls. While it didn't make that much of a difference, the average difference nationally went from Harris leading by 3.4 to Harris leading by 2 when you captured in the Republican leaning polls. That's a major difference. When an election comes down to 11,000, 12,000, 13,000 votes and a 1-point difference nationally seems insignificant, it is significant because it matters, because this election is exceptionally close. And the Washington Post polls even show that as well. Pennsylvania being 2, or Michigan being 2, Pennsylvania being 2 as well. I believe 2, yes. 2 in Pennsylvania, 2 in Michigan, 3 in Wisconsin, 4 in Georgia. That's good for Kamala Harris. But it's still very much competitive because she's losing North Carolina. She's losing Arizona. Both of these states by 3 points. She's tied in Nevada, a state that even Hillary Clinton won in 2016 by 2.4%. It shouldn't be this close for the Democratic ticket, but it is. And all across the board, the map here is really shaping up to be one that comes down and boils through the Sun Belt and through the Rust Belt. And Kamala Harris, unsurprisingly, is maintaining that average in Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, and making inroads in some of these Sun Belt states like Georgia, while still remaining competitive in Nevada, though slightly losing in Arizona and North Carolina. And we will see on Election Day if the Washington Post maintains their strong status on 538, their strong respect amongst average people when it comes down to polling and punditry. They could be right. but they also could be wrong. I'd be very interested to see which one ends up being correct. Ultimately, though, this is what the polls say, 286 to 246, with 6 toss-up electoral votes. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the top left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2024 presidential election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.